beginning of March, I traveled to Maui on vacation with some family. And while we were there, we spent some time hiking and snorkeling, and of course, laying out on the beach. But we also hopped in a rental car and we cruised around the island. And there's a ton of must-see destinations as you tour around Maui, but one in particular is called Mount Haleakala. Mount Haleakala is a dormant volcano on the east side of the island. And over the years, the native Hawaiians have preserved it to become a national park. And it houses some extremely rare animal species that are found nowhere else on Earth. And I mean, this place is big, and the volcano is massive. It's looming over 10,000 feet above sea level, which makes it the tallest point on the island, which means it's also the best spot to watch the sunrise. Now get this, thousands of visitors drive up the volcano every year early in the morning to catch a peek of what's considered to be one of the most spectacular sunrises on Earth. Standing over a massive crater, you wait for the sun to peek over the horizon and you watch as the colors illuminate across the landscape. Actually, Mark Twain, he describes it as the most sublime spectacle I've ever witnessed. You know, as it turns out, it is one of the most photographed spots in Hawaii, and for good reason. So you can just imagine how excited I was as I sleepily stepped out and got into the rental car that morning on our way over. I was thrilled to see this once-in-a-lifetime event. And so after navigating in the dark on this winding road for about 3 hours, we finally made it to the summit. And hundreds of people had joined us on the ascent upwards. And so as we quickly hiked to the crater and we began to wait for the sun to rise. But when we arrived at the edge of the crater, looking out towards the horizon, the only thing that we could see were clouds. Turns out that morning was not a good morning to see the sun rise. There were tons of clouds. And so as I stood out there when I had my camera with me, and I was just waiting for the perfect shot as I stood out in the freezing cold for nearly an hour, and it never happened. In fact, we never even saw the sun through the clouds. Now, there were only two explanations. Either the sun never rose, or I just couldn't see it through the clouds. I think we both know which one it was. How silly would it be for me to assume that the sun didn't rise that morning? We all know that's ridiculous. But there are times when I can quickly fall into that line of thinking with God. You know, if I can't see God working, then it must not be happening. So if God doesn't heal me, or if God doesn't provide this job, or if God doesn't answer my prayer, or if God continues to let this happen, then he's away from his desk or he's not in control. I'd imagine that's probably similar to how the Israelites must have felt in Egypt. After spending years and years toiling in slave labor, they might have assumed that God wasn't going to rescue them. And so every day their hopes and their dreams of freedom dwindled away. But little did they know that while they cried out, God was working behind the scenes to groom Moses, the one who would lead them out of Egypt. There's this amazing conversation that happens between God and Moses at the burning bush. Listen carefully to what God says in Exodus chapter 3. Quote, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Get this, while the Israelites were crying out for help, God was orchestrating their rescue. In fact, he had started the process all the way back when he rescued Moses as a baby in the basket. He was anticipating their need for rescue long before they even realized. Though they couldn't see it, God was working. He was actively involved in their crisis. And thousands of years later, the same reality is offered to us. In our times of crisis, when it's hard to see God's activity and difficult to understand his plan, you have to remember, God is still working. He never clocks out. and He's always on the move. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. The sun still rises and it still sets, even though you're snoozing in bed or watching TV. It's not like God stopped doing that. God is still providing for the cattle on 1,000 hills all around the world. In fact, He's still feeding the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. God is still on the move. And it doesn't depend on what you see with your own two eyes. So, when you're having a tough time seeing the sun between the clouds, or you're having a tough time seeing God's plan in our current crisis, let me remind you, even when I can't see it, He's working. Even when I can't feel it, He's working. He never stops, and He never stops working. And that is the truth. Thanks for joining us, and God bless you.